Let's talk about reading with the grain. The concept of reading with the grain of a piece of literature is a metaphor. If you're going to read with the grain of something, you're going to read in the direction in which it was structured. If you're going to read against the grain, just like sanding a piece of wood against the grain, you're going to cause scratches on it. You're not going to end up with a nice smooth surface. One of the things I teach my college students is how to do both of these things, reading both with and against the grain. But today I want to focus on reading with the grain because it can have a powerful impact on your book club's ability to talk about a controversial text. Last fall, my students chose to read a chapter from Ta-Nehisi Coates's book, Between the World and Me, as one of our major readings for the semester. When they selected it, I thought we were going to have a big struggle understanding even where Coates is coming from with his argument. Because if you've read this book, you know it can be quite challenging for white readers, and my students are mostly white. I thought we were going to have to really struggle with comprehension and with understanding what Coates means when he talks about the dream that white people in America are living in. I was surprised then to find out that my students were actually able to open their minds to the possibilities of Coates's argument, not because they agreed with him. In fact, a lot of them started in a somewhat confrontational stance with his ideas, but because I had taught them to read with the grain. So what does it mean to read a piece with the grain? Well, think back to this piece of wood. You're trying to read with the structure of the piece of literature that you're working with. This doesn't mean that you're trying to agree with it. It means that you're trying to read it the way it's put together. You're trying to put yourself in the author's shoes, to understand his or her argument or perspective before you push against it in your own way. The effect that this had when we were reading Coates's chapter was absolutely remarkable. My students were able to say, here's what I think Coates means when he says the dream, for example. And in the process of doing that, because they had set aside their own differences for later, they were actually able to hear him in a way that they couldn't have heard him otherwise. And when it came time to read him against the grain, their arguments were much more sophisticated and respectful. So if you and your book club have a book that you've been wanting to read together, but you've been avoiding because it seems too controversial and you're worried about where the discussion might go, try this exercise of reading with the grain. I'll give you 3 tips on how to get started. The first time through, when you're reading on your own, try to suspend your own personal responses to the text and read it as you understand the author to intend. It doesn't mean you're agreeing, it just means you're trying to read it as the text was intended to be read. Also, as you're reading, pay attention to the places where the text annoys you or challenges you or offends you, and think of them instead as difficulties. See if you can identify what's causing you to react in that way, and just jot down some notes about that to kind of step back from your reaction and think about where it's coming from. Finally, if you've been reading a shorter text, go back and reread it, and this time try reading it against the grain. Try pushing back against it a little bit. Try challenging, maybe not the whole big idea of it, but smaller parts, smaller pieces of the idea, or maybe just ways in which the idea was presented that you feel are problematic somehow. When it's time to discuss this book with your book club, you can take the same steps. Start by discussing it with the grain, talk about difficulties instead of offenses or annoyances, and then try an against the grain reading and see what happens. If it's anything like what happened in my classroom, I think you'll find that the against the grain readings, the ones that maybe you were worried about in the first place, are going to be more respectful and thoughtful, and you'll actually be able to have an interesting conversation with one another. There are other metaphors available for talking about reading in this way. One of them is in my video on author's intentions, where I talk about Robert Skol's metaphor of centripetal and centrifugal force. There are lots of different ways of talking about reading with an open mind. This is just one of them, but it's one well worth trying. I hope you and your book club will have the courage to try reading something a little bit more controversial and to have a productive conversation about it together. Read on.